Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello, and welcome back to the Hour of History Cities podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and I'm moving in a different direction this week, a different series, a new set of cities that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to take a different approach. Rather than the typical way I've done it in the past, where I chose one city like Havana or Kolkata, and I've gone through the city in detail from its historic beginning to the present day city, and I've analyzed social and cultural and economic gains and losses of the city. I'm going to take it in a different direction, closer to the Russia World Cup series, but not focused broadly on what the city is, not just a general introduction to cities, but rather an introduction to a commodity that made a city a world city, a globally important city. So each week, I'm going to take a city that is important, a city that is foundational for the future growth of many cities around it. So one that leads to growth not only of other cities, but in some cases nations. So rather than just looking at cities, I'm going to be looking at the commodities that end up defining the cities and thus defining much of the history that we study and that we know today. So the first city that I'm going to talk about this week is one that was built on silver. The city, when we think of it today, we don't really think of silver as being an important part of this city necessarily, because it's now a globally important, massively metropolitan, modern city. But in Mexico City's history, silver was one of the most important commodities that linked it not only to its empire, not only to Spain, but to the entire world. So where do we start with a city like Mexico City? Rather than looking back to its pre-colonial stages, it was Tenochtitlan is a famous Aztec city long before it was a city that was conquered by the Spanish. Silver wasn't a traded commodity among the indigenous population, so it doesn't really serve our purposes to go back to the indigenous communities that more or less didn't value silver in the same way that it was valued for the European society. So the silver mint is established in Mexico City in 1535. So after the Spanish Empire actually conquers Tenochtitlan, this Aztec city, and makes it part of its empire, it makes it the most important city of this land empire, a place where it can sort of process its silver before it sends it across the Gulf to a city like Havana and ultimately on to Europe and the rest of the world. So in 1535, the mint was established in Mexico City. And to put that in perspective, not many other cities globally were very big or had even been established by their empires at that point. So it's a very early start for this place of silver production. And the idea was the Spanish were going to take the silver that could be found in mines in great quantities all throughout Central and South America, and they were going to take it to various mints throughout the continents, one of them, the biggest one, being in Mexico City, where they would take the raw silver bars and cut them into 8 pieces. And from those 8 pieces, they would, slice the bar up, and 4 pieces created 2 reals. So the coins were just sliced up bits of silver. It's a long way from what we actually have today, where most of our coins are not actually still made with silver. So silver was an important industry, and it employed people to take this silver, not only the people that were employed both forcefully and enslaved throughout Latin America in order to get the silver from silver mines, but also people to establish this mint and make sure that each of these 8 pieces are stamped for the Spanish Empire and sent back to Spain, so they knew exactly whose property it would be. Between 1530 and 1730, 10 million coins are produced. So it doesn't start out at 10 million coins, but by 1730, every year they're producing 10 million silver coins. And it just continues to grow. By 1800, 24 million coins are produced a year. And what happens is a lot of these coins go across the sea. They go back to Europe, where they're traded for items coming from India, items coming from Asia. The silver peso essentially becomes the universal currency. And that's one thing that empires do. So even though the Spanish Empire, we see them as sort of this conquering force that's setting up and exploiting these silver mines in places like Mexico City, they were also establishing a universal form of trade. So they made this silver something that was recognized as valuable in Europe. They took it from Latin America and they traded it for things from Sevilla, Cadiz, anywhere in the Spanish Empire, and they would trade them for textiles from Italy. They would trade them for goods from France, from Flanders, from England. And what happens is this gold and silver trades for weapons as well. And it ends up being basically the financial backing of all these wars that happen between empires from 1500 on to the end of the Age of Empire, really, when we finally start to leave this currency system that's tied to gold and silver. So it also introduces things like piracy, which eventually leads to the British Empire. So as the Spanish are moving silver across the Gulf of Mexico from Mexico City to Havana and then on to Spain, privateers from Britain are stealing the silver and stealing the gold because it's just as good to be traded in Europe, whether it came legitimately through Spain or not. And a lot of these pieces continue to circulate globally, and what happens is nations that don't necessarily have access to, say, a mint in Mexico City, they melt down the silver and they create their own currency. They don't only create currency in the form of coins, but they also put it on church altars. Women wear the silver. It's traded for marriage and other goods. People tend to like silver throughout the world. And the Spanish had it in great quantities, and they had it in a city in Mexico, Mexico City, that ended up dominating this sort of silver trade. Almost all of these reals are produced in Mexico City up until the 19th century, when more and more Latin American governments start to declare independence from the Spanish Empire. So as that begins to happen, and the British Empire starts taking leadership over the global market and the pound becomes more influential, these mints in Latin America start to fade a little bit, but not entirely. In Mexico City, silver continues to supply the world. Well into the 1880s, it was Mexico's #1 export, silver. And the mint in Mexico City continued until the middle of the 1800s to produce these pesos in what is now Museo Nacional de las Culturas, is now changed from 1850. The building's still there, and it just moved down the street or whatever in Mexico City. So this enormously important silver producing nation and city ends up supplying the entire world with a commodity that it needed. So going abroad today, archaeologists and anthropologists sometimes come across these pieces of silver from the Spanish Empire that date back to this era when Mexico City was the great producer of silver. And although the Spanish Empire and its silver peso and the real eventually ended up fading from the sort of greatness that it once enjoyed, Mexico City never did. And you could make an argument that Tenochtitlan was an important city in Mexico City's central location, geographic location, cultural location. Those all have importance too, for sure. But the fact that it was the center of the world's first real global empire's currency is an enormous reason why Mexico City remained one of the most important cities, and still to this day remains one of the most important cities in Latin America. So although you could make other arguments about why the city is so important, I'm going to stick with my initial response and say Mexico City is a city built on silver. Thanks for listening. If you like this, remember to check out the blog at hourofhistory.com/blog, and be sure to subscribe after each episode. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.